Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. This event is part of Rejuvenate, a spring speaker series brought to you by the McMaster Alumni Association with a focus on mental and physical well-being. My name is Katie Moyse. I'm a science journalist and assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Science at McMaster, and I'll be your host for tonight's discussion. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Heisz. Dr. Heisz is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster and director of the NeuroFit Lab. Her research examines the effects of physical activity on brain function to promote mental health and cognition in young and older adults and individuals with Alzheimer's disease. Her new book, Move the Body, Heal the Mind, reveals how exercise can ease a range of mental health conditions, such as anxiety, attention deficit, depression, and dementia. The book also provides evidence-based strategies for improving focus, creativity, and sleep. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance of tonight's chat. If you'd like to submit a question during the conversation, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will get to as many as we can in the hour. Dr. Heisz, Jen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Your book has something for everyone. Those of us currently navigating mental health challenges and those of us who want to become more resilient to those challenges. Why did you publish this book now? Why is it an important time for us to be more active?
Yeah, so as a scientist, I always wanted to write a book because I know the research that we do in the NeuroFit Lab is really important for people, right? We study the effects of exercise for cognition, for mental health, to prevent dementia, and people want to know information about this. So I sort of thought as my duty to get this information out there, but I kind of thought I would wait till retirement to do it, to be completely honest. But you know, in 2018, I was using a new sport to help me transition through a difficult time in my life. And so I got this idea. I thought, oh, it would be so fun to track my progress through this sport while talking about the science behind it. And so throughout the book, I weave in my personal experience with the science. And I think it just makes for like a fun read, a fun, exploration of the science that actually is quite personal to me. And then it just happened. I mean, the pandemic was smack dab in the middle of me writing this book. I was, still training for my Ironman event, which ends up being like the heroic finish. But in the middle of that was the pandemic, and suddenly the research in the book became significantly more important, right? So at the beginning of the pandemic, we conducted a survey, my lab conducted a survey to just get a pulse of the population. And I mean, not surprisingly, we found that, anxiety, depression were up, physical activity was down. The reason people wanted to exercise had shifted. So instead of wanting to work out to look good, they wanted to work out to feel good. But we found this paradox, like their mental health was getting in the way. So they wanted to work out for their mental health, but they were too stressed or anxious to do so, and they lacked the motivation, which is a symptom of depression. And so this is why the book is so important now, is because when we're not well, but we want to use exercise to be, to heal our minds, to become healthier, it's a different approach to what we're used to doing for our physical performance. And so it's a much more compassionate approach. And I try to weave that throughout the book as well.
It's wonderful. We'll get to some of the different approaches a little later on. Before we go there, your book is very personal, like you said. You describe your own struggles with anxiety. Some of your family members are in the book as well. You even dedicated the book to your daughter, Monica. Was it hard to share such a personal journey with the world?
Yes, 100%. And to be totally honest, this was the first time I had ever told anybody, I had ever shared it. And in fact, my sister, who read the book, after reading it, she was like, Jen, I had no idea, so this is the problem. Well, this is the problem with mental health issues, right? They can remain a secret. They can remain hidden, even from people that you love and are deeply interwoven in your life. And so for me, it is an important piece because I didn't want to just be a scientist telling people what to do, what the research showed. I wanted to let them know that, I also struggle with mental health issues, and I've been able to use exercise to help me manage that and to remain successful. And I think it's really important for people to see representation of successful people who live with and have learned to manage mental health at various degrees. And so I am very candid. I talk about the stress in graduate school when sort of the symptoms started to really get bad. And then I talk about sort of postpartum when they got bad again, and other transitions, including the pandemic, and how I was able to use movement, the power of movement, but other techniques as well, mindfulness, CBT, to help incorporate with exercise to help heal my own mind. And so the book is about mental health and movement, but there's all these additive and add-on therapies that go together really nicely. And I do touch on those too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We invited questions from the community before this talk, and just a reminder to please feel free to add questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We did have a number of questions submitted that probe sort of how certain types of exercise can benefit people with certain types of conditions. And before we get into sort of those specific scenarios, I wonder if you can tell us first, more generally, how moving the body can heal the mind. How is that possible?
Yeah, it's when you don't think about it, it seems weird, right? Like we often separate the body from the mind, but they really are intimately connected. And so when we move the body, just like sort of the basics, there's sort of three basic things that happen. We increase blood flow to the brain, oxygenated blood flow to get to the brain, and the brain needs this to thrive, to survive, to function. So that's number one. Number two is that there's chemicals released from the muscles that move into the blood and move all the way up to the brain, and then give the brain this nourishment that it needs to thrive. And finally, when we exercise, this causes also the release and production of neurochemicals within the brain itself. And so there are all of these things that are happening when we move our body. And the amazing thing is we don't need to be, going to the gym and exercising for an hour to get the benefits. And every step, every movement counts when we're looking at the benefits of exercise for the brain.
Wonderful. I felt steadily reassured reading your book, which was something that I needed right now. It was both motivating and reassuring that what I was doing was good too. You have 411 references in your book. That's a lot. You draw on findings from so many studies, and many of which you conducted in your lab to support the mental health benefits of exercise. And so I want to talk about sort of the field, the scope of what we know so far. How certain are we that exercise has mental health benefits? And do we know everything there is to know?
Yeah, so I'll give a shout out to my former graduate student, Alexis Bullock, who helped me cross-check all the references and do the fact checking, which was a ton of work. So that was a key part. I really wanted everything to be really evidence-based and evidence-supported. And the evidence is strong for the support between exercise and movement and mental health. So in the book, I talk about how we can exercise to relieve anxiety, depression, how we can use it to prevent dementia, even help soothe dementia symptoms. We can use it to promote focus and creativity, and even to improve our sleep. And so the link is there. Exercise can do all of these incredible benefits. I think the missing piece has to do with the mechanism, so exactly how it's working. and in particular how it's working in humans. And so I do go deep into the science, like in an accessible way, but a lot of the mechanistic work has been done in animals. So for example, one of the most exciting new discoveries is around this chemical called lactate. And you may have heard of lactate or lactic acid. And this is typically associated with, like, when our muscles, we're working hard, our muscles start burning. That's related to lactate and the acidic environment it creates within the muscle. And so lactate has been vilified, in the past. And even in fitness classes now that I go to, they're often like, okay, flush out that lactate, as if it's like a bad thing, right? But it turns out that lactate may be one of the most powerful promoters of neuroplasticity. So when our muscles are working hard, lactate can accumulate. It goes from the blood to the brain and reports to this brain region called the hippocampus, which is critical for memory and learning, and is also the brain region that's devastated by Alzheimer's disease. And so when lactate gets there, it starts promoting the birth of newborn brain cells, which can help improve the hippocampal function and potentially even ward off dementia. However, all of this research around lactate has only been done in animal models. And so we're not 100% sure whether it works in humans, but the lab just got a big grant to study this. And so to answer your question, yes, we do know quite a lot about the benefits of movement for the mind and the brain. And we still need more research to work out the mechanism. And we're right at the front lines there in my lab.
That's wonderful. Congrats on your grant.
Thank you.
Are certain types of exercise better than others? And I know that's a big question. So yeah. I guess approach it however you want.
Yeah, I mean, it does really depend on what you're going for, right? And so one of the special things about the book that I tried to do was at the end of each chapter, I tried to synthesize the science into actionable workouts for people. So there's like a week that has 2 aerobic exercises, 2 resistance exercises that you can do. You don't need fancy equipment or gym membership. You can do them in the comfort of your own home if you want. And so that builds up from like beginner level all the way to advanced. And so it does really depend on what you're going for. But things that we've shown in the lab, so for example, if you want to improve your focus, we've all been sitting a lot lately, right? And unfortunately, often in this context where we're talking over Zoom or watching something over Zoom. And so what I would encourage people to do, especially even during this webinar, is to stand up and move. So our research shows that even just short, frequent movement breaks are enough to help the brain stay focused. Because when our brain is online and trying to focus for, like, let's say, a 60-minute lecture, a 60-minute webinar, what ends up happening is, like, we're sharp and focused at the beginning, but as time goes by, the brain starts getting tired, it starts mind wandering. Maybe you're thinking about, oh, what should we have for dessert? Or maybe you haven't eaten yet, or maybe what's for dinner? And so this is the natural default state of the brain. And so when we want to stay focused and pay attention to the content, exercise breaks can help us do that. So in my lab, we've shown 5-minute exercise breaks in the middle of a lecture help students stay focused on that lecture, and then they perform better on their test afterwards. And so these short, frequent breaks are something that people can incorporate into their day, and it would work the same way for workers as it did for the students. So it will help you stay focused, help you be more productive at work. So that's with respect to, like, focus, these short breaks. In that study, we used high intensity workouts, like jumping jacks and high knees, but the research shows it doesn't have to be intensive. It could just be like a self-paced walk. So just a walk around the block, or even just like a stretch, something that moves the body to stand up and stretch, or move the body in a way that sort of, you for a moment, just change the context with which your body's in. And then thinking about depression, for example, there's some really good research that summarized all the literature showing that when it comes to aerobic exercise, duration matters more than intensity. So for every 10 minutes that we walk, for example, then we get an additional benefit to reducing our depressive symptoms. So, and that's up to about 1 hour. But when it comes to resistance exercise or strength-based exercises, the more intensive the exercise, the better. So intensity matters most there. So when we're lifting heavier weights, we get an even bigger benefit for depression. And the same is true in the research we've done looking at sleep. So the more frequently you do resistance exercise and the heavier that resistance exercise is, the better you sleep that night.
That's awesome. Coming back to what you said about focus, it's such a good reminder at a time when we're all so busy and it just feels like there's so much to do, that there's benefits to stepping away and moving our bodies, that it will actually improve our output, our productivity. I think we all need reminders of that.
Yeah, because it often feels like counterproductive, right? Oh, I don't have time to exercise right now. I have this deadline. And so you just sit there and you work on the thing. But what happens is when you take these exercise breaks, you infuse your brain with all these neurochemicals that make it function more optimally. So you can get your work done better and in less time. You're more focused and you're more creative. So yeah, it certainly need to take these moments for ourselves, especially in these times.
Yes, indeed. All right. If you have a physical limitation, can very simple movements still have benefits?
Yeah. So the research shows that the benefits for exercise for mental health, really it comes down to every step counts, and that some movement is better than no movement. And that's really where you see the biggest change. So most of the research done in this field has usually done like biking, walking, or weight training. However, what I tried to do in the book is tried to make it more inclusive so that it could be any form of movement, like swimming, dancing. It could be like arm cycling if you don't have, use of your legs, or, yoga if the more stretching, seated yoga could work, so there are lots of different options. And the main point is we need to be moving our body more in ways that feel safe and comfortable for us. And yeah, that's like the beautiful part about using exercise or move. I like to call it movement because I feel like exercise kind of, it does exclude people, right? Movement is much more, everyone can move their body in some way and in a way that feels right for them. And that the research shows that every movement counts when it comes to mental health.
Okay. I really loved the focus on what you just said, feeling safe and comfortable. That's such an important part, because if you don't have that, you're not going to continue. You're going to stop. And a huge part of your book was just wanting folks to feel like, to build this into their daily life so that it begins to feel good. So it feels inclusive in the way that you talk about it. We hear a lot about inflammation these days. You talk about inflammation in your book. What is the role of inflammation in connecting the body and the mind?
This is so fascinating, the role of inflammation on the brain. So yes, we've been hearing a lot about inflammation related to the immune system, because inflammation increases when we are, when the body is fighting off like a cold or infection or a virus. We get this increase in inflammation, and the inflammation increases in our body, but it can also increase in our brain as well. And then it can have some psychological symptoms. And these are often called sickness behaviors when we're sick. So, okay, imagine last time you were sick. What were you doing? Likely you were at home, alone, in bed, watching Netflix, maybe binge watching Netflix, right? And this is like stereotypical of sickness behavior. And actually, it's inflammation in the brain that's to blame. It's not you. And I like to think of it as the brain's like natural instinct for social distancing, right? And it's a small price to pay to keep other people safe. So we're at home. The problem is that we can get this like so-called sickness behavior even when we're not sick. And this is where the problem comes into play. So chronic stress can also cause inflammation and elevated inflammation within the body. It's called a sterile immune response because there's no bacteria or virus in the body. The body is like clean or healthy, but what's happening is the chronic stress starts to damage the cells, and this launches an immune response, increasing inflammation within the body and within the brain, and then it can start causing these sickness behaviors. The difference is, though, like typically when we get sick with a cold or flu, we're better within a couple weeks, 1 or 2 weeks, we're back on the mend. However, with chronic stress, it can last a lot longer. And so you're like stuck in this funk, you're exhausted, you're antisocial, your mood's low for weeks, months, and you're not sure what's happening. And so obviously that sounds a lot like depression, right? And so there is this stress-induced depression that seems to be really related to inflammation. Now, the challenge here is that when it's inflammation causing depression, these individuals may not respond to the typical medication approach to treating depression, which is, serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs, which are pretty much the mainstream of antidepressants. And so the research shows that about 1 in 3 people don't respond to these antidepressant drugs, which may come as a surprise to people that they don't respond. So they'll take their meds and they'll experience no relief. And research shows that in these individuals in particular, these drug-resistant forms of depression, they often have high levels of inflammation. The great news for them is that exercise is the medicine that they need because exercise is actually anti-inflammatory. So initially, an acute bout of exercise can increase inflammation, but the beautiful mechanism here is that immediately after you finish exercising, the muscles release these like anti-inflammatory, like almost like a cleanup crew that cleans up all that inflammation and then some, so that as you exercise more regularly, the body becomes less and less inflamed, and that can not just clean up the inflammation in the body, but the brain too, and it can help reduce depressive symptoms. Like a clinically significant and meaningful reduction in depressive symptoms that is on par with antidepressant drugs. And so exercise is medicine for depression, especially for drug-resistant non-responders, but it is also an amazing add-on therapy for people who do take their meds because they are transformative for a lot of people. But adding exercise onto their medication helps to reduce some of the side effects that they might not like. It also can even help reduce some of the dosage that they might have to take. And so that's the link between inflammation and the mind and the body, and how inflammation can cause depression, but then how exercise can help treat depression, but also prevent it. So research from my lab shown that 6 weeks of chronic stress within students can lead to clinically significant depression in otherwise healthy students that had never had a diagnosis before, which, that's scary and startling, but exercise can actually help buffer against the chronic stress effects. So we used moderate intensity continuous cycling there, and we used high intensity interval cycling, and both resulted in like the buffering of the stress effects on depression. But the lighter exercise resulted in a less inflamed body and less stress. And so it seems like the lighter intensity exercises are especially good when we're in these stressful situations. And why? Well, because we only have one stress response for all stressors, and that's like physical stress of exercise, but also like the psychological stress from our life. And so when we have lots of stress in our life, and then we try to add on exercise stress on top of that, our tolerance for exercise stress may be lower, and it could cause more, push us over from the good stress into the bad stress that we don't want. So we like to think about stress as like, we need a certain amount of stress in our life to adapt and grow stronger. But after a certain threshold, that stress actually does the opposite. It becomes damaging and weakens us. And so exercise helps us to push us like right up to that good level of stress where we can adapt and grow stronger. But when we have a baseline psychological stress, it's more likely to tip us over. And so we just have to be careful around playing with the intensity and load so that we don't overly stress the system.
Okay, and your book has some good strategies for sort of easing and building up and getting close to that sweet spot, the right amount of stress. All right, we had a question submitted to the Q&A. You mentioned how you use movement, but also other strategies like mindfulness and CBT. We have a question from the audience about the connection between moving the body and mindfulness. Like, how do these things work together?
Yeah, so we've done research in my lab to show that they're really interrelated. So people who tend to be more active are also more mindful, and people who are more mindful also tend to be more active. So there's this bidirectional relationship between the two. And in the book, I try to kind of catalyze that connection a little bit more explicitly, because we don't often think about it. But mindfulness, when you think about it at its core, it's like being in the present moment, right? And often what it is like paying attention to breath is one of the easiest ways to get into the moment, get out of your head and into your body, right? And so a lot of mindfulness techniques start with just, focus on the breath, focus on the breathing. And you can do that with exercise, right? So I'm an avid runner, and I will pay attention to my breath or pay attention to my foot strike while I'm moving. And all of these are forms of moving meditation. And you could do the same thing with walking, right? You can focus on your breathing while you're walking and create the movement into a meditation. And so that's how the two can be coupled, like in practice. The really cool thing about mindfulness, the way it works within the brain, is that within the brain, we have this like threat detection, fear detection center called the amygdala. And the amygdala is, it gets hyperactivated when we're anxious, or, when if we're suffering from something like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. The amygdala is overly activated, and it has a direct line to the stress response. And so it can turn it on and keep it on. And exercise builds up this resiliency factor called neuropeptide Y, which can help soothe the amygdala. But the amygdala, what ends up happening when we're under stress is that it gets disconnected from the prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of that. This is like our rational part of the brain that helps send calming, more rationalized thoughts to the amygdala, which tends to be like overly emotional and reactive. And so under stress, the amygdala essentially becomes an island. And what mindfulness can do is help re-engage the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala. So it helps enhance the connectivity, the communication between the two, to help calm the anxious amygdala. And when there's that resiliency factor, neuropeptide Y, built with exercise, the whole process is much easier to do. So I think that's how they work together. More research needs to be done to really solidify that connection, but the puzzle pieces are there to start to draw the lines between the two.
Interesting. There were some comments too in the chat about not all walks, or I guess some confessions that sometimes it is a mindless walk. Is that okay too?
Yeah.
There's something to be
Yeah.
said for that.
Yeah. No worries. And in fact, these mindless walks often can produce a lot of creativity, right? So there's research showing that just a self-paced walk, just a 10-minute self-paced walk is enough to boost creativity. And the reason why is sort of the brain, at least the prefrontal cortex in particular, has sort of two modes, like inhibit, which is like a focus mode, which we do need to pay attention to our breath, to pay attention to our body, to ignore distraction. And then it has this mental flexibility mode where we're sort of thinking outside the box, or being creative, or drawing connections. And it's that side of it, the mental flexibility, that we need to come up with our creative and ingenious ideas. And so when we're playing around, when we're walking and we're sort of mind wandering, that helps to create new connections that can boost creativity when we're doing focused work. So no worries.
Good to know.
There's no guilt or shame here. We're moving your body is good.
Awesome. Okay, we had some questions about the protective effects of exercise, particularly with respect to Alzheimer's disease. So I wonder if you can tell us what we know.
Yeah, so this has been a focus of my lab. We've done a lot of work on this. And one of the most interesting findings we had was that physical inactivity contributes to dementia risk as much as genetics. So we often think about, Alzheimer's disease, brain disease, as like being something that we don't have control over. And that's pretty scary, But to show that something as simple as moving your body can actually alter your fate, in this scary disease. You can't change your genes, but you can change your lifestyle. And I think that this is such a hopeful message for a lot of people that, moving can reduce your dementia risk, which is amazing. And so how to move to reduce your dementia risk? Well, research from my lab suggests that one of the best ways to move is walking. And if you're already a regular walker, you might need to pick up the pace a little bit. So we've shown in my lab that interval walking in particular is really beneficial for boosting memory. What's interval walking? Well, it's like you're doing your regular walk, but every now and then you're picking up the pace. So for example, you're picking up the pace between light posts, or maybe you're adding a few hills into your route. And the reason this is really good is because when we work out at a little bit more of an a vigorous intensity, what happens is lactate can start to accumulate. And like I said before, that lactate's really good for promoting growth in the hippocampus, which is the region we really want to fortify to keep dementia at bay. And so if you're out for your regular walk and you're wondering, am I walking fast enough? You can do the talk test, which is such a simple way to figure out your intensity. So you start walking and you ask yourself, can I talk comfortably right now? If the answer is yes, this is a pretty good pace for your easy intervals. Okay, so now pick up the pace. And once it becomes difficult to have a conversation, then that's where you want to be. You're likely above your lactate threshold. The lactate's accumulating. That's where you want to be for the harder intervals. And you don't have to walk that way the whole walk. It can just be intermittently. And so the research shows that, 3 minutes at easy, 3 or 4 minutes at the harder pace, we've shown improves memory better than regular walking. Other research shows that it can reduce high blood pressure, especially if it's high. It can help with blood sugar regulation, especially if you have type 2 diabetes. And it can help boost fitness, especially if it's low. And so this tweak to the regular walk, I think is really fun. And it's something that a lot of older people like to walk already, and they're already walking. It's just such a nice little tweak that they can do to their walk to optimize the benefits for their brain health.
That's great. And I really loved that the talk test. I hadn't heard of that before. I've heard of VO2 max, and it just seems so abstract. But the talk test is so real, and we can feel it. And actually, the more you exercise, the more capable you are of of talking at those, it's your threshold just grows. And so it's another good gauge to sort of check in and see how you're progressing in your fitness. Okay, so we talked a little bit about prevention. We have some folks wondering, can exercise reverse damage that's already been done, say from years of depression, head trauma, or neurodegenerative disease?
Yeah, so when we think about depression or head trauma, for example, like a common underlying thread there is chronic stress, often inflammation's involved. And so what can happen is that the cells within the brain will start to, some of them will die, some of them will shrivel. The hippocampus in particular is a big target for this. And one thing that can happen is that the damage in the hippocampus, not only is the hippocampus important for memory and learning and Alzheimer's prevention, but it also helps to shut off the stress system. So it plays a pretty big role there. And when those cells are damaged, it's more difficult to shut off the stress system. And so stress levels can remain elevated. And this is why it can be sometimes really difficult to get out of that, the cycle of depression. But the good news is that exercise can help rebuild the brain. So the brain is actually really quite self-healing, which is such a beautiful thing to be reminded of. The body and the brain are self-healing, and exercise can help speed up that healing, which is such a beautiful thing that it does. And one of the reasons it does this is that immediately after every single workout that we do, we produce and increase the amount of growth factors that we have in our brain. And one of those growth factors is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which actually helps support the birth of brand new brain cells. It helps the brain cells that are there function and survive. And so what we see, even in this is mostly done in animal models, but animal models where they've induced chronic stress for a long period of time, and then they reintroduce exercise, what happens is those shriveled brain cells start to bloom and they rebirth. It's such a beautiful thing that, once we remove the stressor, or even if it's still there, exercise can help start rebuilding in the brain. And we see this not just with depression and head trauma. The same thing with when we gradually increase physical activity, it really helps the brain to heal after post-concussion. This has become a really important piece there. And addiction has a very damaging effect on the reward system, but when exercise is reintroduced early during the treatment process, it can help that part of the brain heal faster. And just reopens up the reward system. Really beautiful thing. Within the aging brain, if we're thinking about depression or cognitive impairment, for example, some of the most amazing research is in mild cognitive impairment. So this is a condition where you're not quite suffering from dementia, but you're not healthy either. You're sort of kind of in this no man's land. And there's research showing that individuals with mild cognitive impairment that exercise are more likely to revert back to normal, which is such an amazing thing. And so yes, the answer is yes. The brain does help. Exercise does help the brain heal. It helps it, function, thrive, because it nourishes it, and it helps sort of unlock its self-healing processes, which is just such an amazing thing, the human brain.
It is amazing. And that's such an important reminder for all of us at any stage that this is something that we can do. some of us have injuries and worry that exercise might exacerbate pain. There were several questions submitted on this topic, and you addressed it in your book as well. What should we do?
Yeah, so once you get clearance, obviously you want to get clearance from your healthcare provider or whoever's guiding you in your fitness journey, especially when you're dealing with things like chronic pain, or if you're recovering from, say, like a heart attack or a stroke or something. What we find is that a lot of people can be afraid to start exercising again. In cases of people who are suffering from chronic pain, many are afraid that it's going to exacerbate their pain, and that's a real fear that keeps a lot of people from exercising. The same is true with heart disease and people who've suffered from a heart attack. And many of them, like a lot of people, will actually experience a post-traumatic stress disorder. So we often associate like PTSD with combat, but actually sometimes the war can be within, and we can be afraid that the body is going to give out on us again. And so anything that reminds us of that traumatic event, which, let's say for a heart attack, is the heart, racing. You get that with exercise. And so people who exercise is a form of rehab that is very helpful for people who've suffered from a heart attack. It can help prevent it. And there is this interesting research showing that a lot of people are afraid of exercising. They're afraid of moving. They won't take the stairs. They won't garden. Some won't even have sex because they're afraid of their heart being elevated. But it is this exercise that their body needs to rebuild and keep their heart healthy. And so I do talk a lot about how our psychological fear can be a resistance to exercise. And I think for a lot of people, just acknowledging it and realizing that their own fears may be holding them back from getting the help that they actually need. So in the case with heart disease, exercise is medicine for their heart. And in the case of chronic pain, exercise is often the only thing that will actually help relieve their chronic pain. And so I do talk a lot about how there's these real fears that we have that can be getting in the way, and some of the things that we can do to start moving past them. And of course, it's baby steps, and it's almost like an exposure therapy. And I talk about this really explicitly with anxiety sensitivity. So anxiety sensitivity is a form of anxiety. Well, it can be with an anxiety disorder, but it's like the fear of the symptoms that anxiety causes in the body. So heart racing, difficulty breathing. And people with anxiety sensitivity, they often avoid exercising because it terrifies them. And they certainly will avoid vigorous exercise because it causes those same symptoms that they fear, and they think they're going to die. And so what the research shows, though, is that these high intensity bursts are really helpful for helping people with anxiety sensitivity get over their fears. And so how it works is that you do these, like, it's almost like a microdose of fear, right? So you expose yourself to this microdose of exercise at a vigorous intensity. So let's say in the book, I call it the fear buster workout. So you go for your wellness walk, which is like an easy self-paced walk. And then at the end, when you're feeling good, you sprint. And I'm not talking very far. I'm like 10 seconds, just sprint. You feel your body activate, all the, the heart's racing, it's difficult to breathe. You expose yourself to those symptoms, and then you watch those symptoms like come back down, and you're safe. And, nothing bad has happened. And that's an exposure to start retraining your brain that exercising and exercising vigorously is safe. And so 10 seconds is not a lot, but it's that baby step that we need. And then once we're comfortable with that, we can start layering and building onto it. And so sometimes it can be like we need to have like a compassion. This is where the compassionate part comes in, because it's not just about like physical ability. Often it's sometimes about like psychological barriers that we have to overcome as well. And so I do offer some tips in the book about that. But yes, baby steps, compassionate approach, consistency is key.
Baby steps, yes. Once again, the importance of feeling safe and comfortable in whatever you're doing, and that there are ways to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about the workouts. Before we get there, I think it's safe to say that many of us would like to be more active, but find it difficult to fit exercise in with our lives or to find the motivation. Your book has some great suggestions on how to overcome this, and I'm wondering if you can share some of your top tips.
Yeah. So first of all, it's not your fault. We can blame the brain here. The brain actually makes us lazy. And this is a relic of our evolutionary past when, think back then we had to hunt and gather our food, expend a lot of energy. And when we weren't moving to survive, we needed to conserve our energy, right? So flash forward to today, we don't really, need to run away from a saber-toothed tiger. We don't need to move to survive in the moment, at least. And so the brain sees voluntary exercise as like an extravagant expense, and it goes out of its way to talk us out of it, like, oh, you're too tired, you don't have time for this, and its pleas are relentless. But okay, so yes, there are ways to get around it, and this is where the prefrontal cortex comes into play, the logical, most evolved brain region. So my go-to tip, because yes, this is something I still struggle with, even though I know the benefits of exercise. Sometimes it takes me 30 minutes to get off the couch to the gym for my 30-minute workout. And so my go-to is blocking it off in the calendar first. So this is so simple, but just making time for it so you have the time. The other thing with this is actually planning out your workout completely before you even go. So having that done ahead of time. And the reason why this is helpful is because we often don't think exercising requires a lot of willpower. And when we have to make decisions at the moment on the fly, that drains our willpower. And so we have less left over to do the exercise itself. And so when we plan ahead, we can save that willpower so that it's easier for us to motivate ourselves up off the couch. Other fun tricks, working out with friends is really, really motivating for a lot of people. And you get the additional benefit of brain health. So there's this one study that I just love. It was done in older adults who worked out either with a group or by themselves. And the ones who exercised in the group had better health, even though they weren't exercising as much as the ones who were exercising alone. And so you can get by with both, with less. And it just really underscores the benefit of also social engagement, social interaction for brain health as well, which becomes such it can be seamlessly integrated into movement, which is something I really like and touched on in the book. So there's other ways like listening to your favorite music or listening to a podcast. And when we do things that we enjoy with people that we enjoy, this is a naturally rewarding experience that increases dopamine in the brain. And that can help teach us that movement is rewarding, just by, virtue of connection between these, the things we already naturally enjoy. And then once we start moving, exercise itself increases dopamine, which can help reinforce the behavior and make it more motivating. So it really is just like that initial off the couch, out the door, because once your body starts moving, it actually feeds the brain what it needs to stay moving. So it's like that you can just kind of go with that momentum, which is really helpful. There's this this is my last one. Super fun. This one I just find so funny, but it's It's called, well, I call it the swish and spit. So basically, you take like a sip of a sugary drink and you just have to swish it in your mouth. You don't have to swallow it. And then you just spit it out. And research shows that this actually is enough to help increase your motivation to exercise, reduces the effort that you feel, especially during that first part of the workout when it feels extra hard. And I think that this is related to like reassuring the lazy brain that, oh, resources are plenty. Okay, we're good to go. We can expend this energy even if it feels extravagant. And so I think that's a really fun one. Just, we can have fun with this and play with it. But also knowing that it is hard and then we may need a little bit of an extra boost. Especially in times when we're, it's been a long day and we're not feeling up for it. But you're not alone. That it happens. It's a struggle.
Yes, motivation, and it's funny that we have to trick the brain to do these things that are good for it. Yeah. Your book has a number of suggested workouts, from the Fresh Start workout, the Fearless workout, the Healer workout. Lots, again, something for everyone in here. But let's say someone has a free 15 minutes, but no equipment, just some sneakers, and let's say the wonderful outdoors, which I'm hoping will get a little warmer and less rainy in the coming days. What's the best way, in your opinion, for a person to spend those 15 minutes?
Oh, the best way. Well, I mean, if you're outside in nature, that would be a nice way to walk around. Spend 15 minutes walking outside in nature. Yeah, in the bright sunshine. That would give you like the sun, the boost from the sun. Walking in nature is really restorative for both cognition and for the mood. Yeah, so that would be such a nice way. It boosts creativity, it could boost your focus, it will help increase blood flow to the brain. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we don't want to underestimate those, short bursts of movement. And sometimes that's all we can fit in. And that's enough. That's better than nothing. And so, yeah, that would be nice. I have like, if it depends on what you like to do. So this is a hard question to answer, right? I do have like a NeuroFix workout in the book. That's just 4 minutes, where it's like you could just do some jumping jacks, some push-ups, some simple workouts you can even do in your office. So yeah, the options are endless, and I tried to give a lot of variety of the things that you could do, but don't underestimate the power of short bursts of movement. They can be extremely beneficial and restorative for the brain.
That's great. And find something that feels good,
right for you.
right?
Yeah, feels good for you. And that's the thing, is when we move in ways that feel good for us, we're more likely to do it. Research shows that if you don't feel good within the first 2 workouts, you're less likely to stick with it over the long term. And so this is the key. Like, this is a life thing, we got to do this for the rest of our life. We might as well pick something that we like, or, I'm someone who likes to change it up, right? So sometimes in the winter, I like hot yoga. Right now I'm running outside. I'm doing some weight training. I had mentioned for 3 years I was doing the triathlon training. So, you don't have to pick one thing and stick with it. You can kind of play around with it and have fun with it. And because it is something that we do need to have in our life. The brain expects us to move, although it resists it. It's expecting us to move, right? It needs us to move to get all the nutrients that it needs to thrive. And when we're not moving enough, we don't feel well. And that's really the bottom line.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes left. We had some questions submitted beforehand from some parents and guardians. We're wondering, what's your advice to those of us wanting to help our kids stay active? Is there a sweet spot between too little and too much exercise? Are team sports better than individual ones?
Okay, yeah. So I have a 10-year-old and the struggle is real. And so, yeah, so there's some interesting research. So we've done some research in the lab looking at the link between physical activity and academic performance, which is really strong. It's really great. And within elementary school kids, the research shows that we can often get by with less activity for mental health than we can with physical health. And so for kids, for elementary school kids, 1 to 2 days was better than 0 days. 3 days, 3 to 4 days was even better. And then like every day was best. So that was with elementary school kids. With high school kids, it was like 3 to 4 days was sort of the minimum dose, and more wasn't significantly better, at least in terms of, the time that they're active during the week, the frequency that they're active. When it comes to sport, this is kind of interesting. So there's research showing structured versus free play, so like the ratio of the two. Some of the most creative adults, they looked back into their childhood to see what was their structured versus free play time. And it turns out that the one of the ideal combinations or ratios is about 50% structured sport and 50% free play and that created more creative adults, like in all areas of life, than 70% structured activity and 30% free play. And so the idea is that when kids are allowed to play, they're allowed to make mistakes. They're allowed to trial and error. They're experimenting with their movement. They're experimenting with their mind, and it's more fun. They're more fully engaged. And that type of thinking coupled with movement helps to create this, it helps to shape up that mental flexibility that we need to think outside the box, think creatively, problem solve. So that's really cool. And then there's some really interesting research on the type of sport that you do. And so this relates to how you train. So there's certain sports produce more creative people, and it might surprise you. So it's not the artistic sports like gymnastics, synchronized swimming, but it's the net and combat sports. And the reason why is because it depends on how you train. So with artistic sports, like figure skating, for example, you're working out, but you're following a prescribed plan, right? And you don't want to deviate from that plan. So you have to stay focused, and you're not really being creative, right? Whereas with net and combat sports, it's like dynamic interplay with the competitor. It's improvised. You have to react on the fly, and this helps flex your mental flexibility. So as you train your body, you're also training your brain, and that's sort of how we have to think about it. And so kids that have the train in those sports end up being more creative, which is I think really fascinating. But even if sports is not your thing, the idea is doing different things with your body. So like I mentioned before, we're often we're sitting all day, and even just changing the position of our body and moving our body in space, or even just going for a simple walk, is enough to sort of change the context, change the brain, and then that can help revitalize, reinvigorate the mental flexibility that we need to be creative. So yeah, there's lots of cool things. I mean, I don't want to overly burden parents because there's always already a lot going on, right? And so I think getting your kids to move a little bit more every day, these short bursts work, and when they play, they're moving and they're not thinking about it. It doesn't feel like exercise. They just want to go play with their friends. And so we can see that as movement. It doesn't have to be a structured sport that you have to drive them to and wait there for an hour after school. That can be a lot on parents, and it's not necessary. So there's the good news.
Sorry, I'm muted. That's great and fascinating about that research. We're at 8 o'clock. I have one last question, and this was a very common theme in the questions submitted beforehand, and I see some more coming up now. some audience members are keen to get started. I know I feel inspired from reading your book and listening to all this, but some of us are worried that maybe it's too late, that we should have started this a little earlier. Is it ever too late?
No. It's never too late. Never too late to start. In our study, like we've had seniors in who hadn't been exercising. They were between the ages of 65 and 80, and they saw memory benefits within the first few months of exercising. So it's never too late to start. Remember, some movement is better than none. You want to focus on consistency and just from now on, right? From now on. Don't worry about what happened in the past. That's all right.
Starting now.
Starting now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jen. This was such a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. A reminder that we'll be giving away 10 copies of Dr. Heisz's book. We'll randomly select the winners tomorrow morning. We'll notify the lucky 10 people by email. Thank you, Jen, once again. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful restorative spring. Take care.